Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 12 cheat sheet as we look ahead, of course, to a week where we've got a sea of injuries and also a lot of dramatic changes in terms of how we rate certain positions. If you haven't seen the cheat sheet before, it's effectively a series where I rank all the players in terms of efficiency and look at the price point of certain players and how good they are based on the color coding that I have. And the idea, of course, is looking at the underlying stats of the season as well as historically, plus let's say any intangibles like penalties or set pieces to forecast the next few fixtures based on fixture difficulty, who are the best picks. And if we get started with the midfield position, or actually before we start with the midfield position, if I can also ask you guys to subscribe to the channel if you've been enjoying the series so far and you're an avid viewer. 50% of the viewers who watch my videos are unfortunately still not subscribed, and I would love to get the channel to 20,000 subscribers by the end of this year, so let's try and make that happen. As far as the midfield, going back to it now, the change that I have first up is in the sort of 5.x position. Johnson is a new sort of differential. I have also dropped Douglas Luiz to that price point. And the issue, of course, with Johnson, even though he seems like he's going to have a nailed position for the Spurs team, is because of Richarlison's sort of long-term injury due to surgery and also Douglas Luiz having worse fixtures, plus Johnson also having tough fixtures. Even though he's going to be one of the starting players for Spurs, you're looking at these two picks being not so good because whilst Douglas Luiz has the intangibles and Johnson will probably have much better open play underlying stats because Spurs are actually quite a good attacking team. And of course, simply by having minutes within the Spurs attack, you're going to do well. My issue, of course, is overall strength of Spurs, particularly in terms of build-up play. When you see, for example, someone like Udogie out, that actually hampers the way Spurs attack out from the back. You'll see that's why, for example, someone like Romero had to substitute Ben Davies in previous fixtures because he just wasn't cutting it. As far as the defense, of course, Romero and Van de Ven, huge as part of that process. So I think given that you've got Aston Villa and Man City games so close around the corner for Spurs, much tougher fixtures, I just don't see the value of really going towards Johnson for now. And with Douglas Luiz, it's a case where the fixtures are just bad, and ultimately you're sort of buying into a player who hopefully will get, a little bit of luck in terms of the swing for penalties and also something like set pieces actually turning out really well for him. But that's always going to be a little bit easier on easier fixtures, and that sort of value just isn't there right now. As far as the midfield in the 6.x position, we have Kudus and Eze as your sort of new differentials. And with Kudus, of course, you've got a generally good run of games when you look ahead to the next three fixtures, and that's why, of course, we've been rating Bowen for a while. He has Nottingham Forest, Burnley, and Crystal Palace, and actually recently has sort of come towards getting starting positions within this West Ham team. Also sort of clocked a full 90 game in the previous match, whilst also effectively being the man of the match from a West Ham point of view. So if you look at Kudus, if he gets minutes, he's actually going to be a better option than Bowen. But the concern, of course, right now is that I don't think he's absolutely nailed because there are also games where, let's say if Kudus has a bad game, someone else can come into the team and simply take the minutes back. Part of the reason why Kudus played so many minutes in the previous match was because Paqueta was suspended, and that's not going to happen. So I do think right now he's a yellow pick if you really want to jump on a punt. Because he's such a good player and because the fixtures are so good, and even though the minutes are poor, I've still classed him as a yellow option, but I do think he's quite risky. As far as Eze, I think he's the opposite effectively because we're just waiting for Eze to come back to full fitness, right? Eze ultimately has a fantastic fixture to start with, and generally the fixture run is quite clean, which is why obviously a lot of people have been investing into the Crystal Palace defense as of late, or even Edouard. But right now with Eze coming back, I do think the overall attacking strength of the team will develop, and of course he has a lot of set pieces and penalties towards his handle. So Eze for me is a great option. I would consider him if, let's say, you have any midfield injury that has developed this week, such as, let's say, if Madison's out and you can't afford Saka for whatever reason, then Eze could actually be quite a good option to jump into for the time being. But of course, you've got Mitoma and Mbumo reigning supreme. With Mbumo, it's more a case where I think you can obviously continue to own some players like Diaby, who's actually dropped for the foreseeable future until, let's say, Game Week 14, because, of course, you don't really want to be jumping onto Mbumo versus Liverpool away. It's not the best fixture to jump onto. If anything, if you have the luxury position to jump onto Mitoma for 2 weeks, I'd probably do so and then jump onto Mbumo in Game Week 14. If you own Diaby, for example, I'd at least give Diaby Game Week 12 and then move on to Mbumo in that Arsenal home fixture, because when you compare it, actually, Diaby away versus Spurs, not exactly the best, even though, of course, Spurs are now lacking in terms of center backs. So that could be actually a signal, once again, to hold on to someone until Game Week 14 and then just move to Mbumo there as soon as you have Luton Town at home. As far as Doku, he's also a new differential. We had Doku as a differential a couple of weeks ago, but he actually was really struggling for minutes. And of course, Grealish is back in the team, and Grealish has actually put some good performances, right? He's been spoken about by Pep in terms of his sort of strength in terms of La Pausa, and obviously just being a very great hold-up player in games where they need more control. And obviously, Doku is effectively the exact opposite of that at times, where I think the one thing that Doku has over Grealish is the fact that he can maybe play two wings at once, which is something that, of course, Pep is trying to sort of hone in with Doku and improve in terms of his game, his ability to sort of shift onto the right and actually alternate in flanks. That actually helps a lot with, for example, someone like Foden or Bernardo, who can sort of also play on any side of the pitch right now in the attacking position. So I do think Doku's an interesting differential, but I really don't think he's a great pick. He was very, very fortunate to get the returns that he did versus Bournemouth, and of course he put in an exceptional performance, but I don't think we need to overrate that performance and suddenly think that he's a must-buy option. That was a freak performance, in my opinion. Some of the goals, if you see, for example, were from ridiculous chances, from rebounds left and right. So I would probably avoid Doku for now. As far as the 7.x position, no changes there. We did give Foden a rise last week. I do think he'll get very consistent minutes going forward. So of course, he was rested in the previous fixture, but we also know that Foden, I think, is also struggling with some sort of knocks. So it's probably the case that he's going to have very, very consistent minutes until KDB is back. And for that reason, I still think Foden is actually a great pick. But of course, once again, consider Man City options as part of that sort of free at 18 strategy if you want to pursue that. As far as, let's say, 8.x options, I put an asterisk over Maddison because we don't really have a full update on his news. And of course, even though he wasn't seen in training so far, at the time of recording of this video, this is actually right after the Champions League games have all culminated. Unfortunately, Man United just lost to Copenhagen, but you're looking at a position where, unfortunately, Ange will probably give us the sort of diagnosis of Maddison, but he was 50-50 last time. I remember there was a very similar situation with Maddison having a knock in the previous fixture, and Maddison was actually declared fit to play, and he actually was able to start the next fixture. So I'm not too concerned. Ultimately, Maddison's probably a good hold until, let's say, you give him the Wolves game, and if he's ready to start, for example, then you can transfer him out. However, of course, if Ange confirms that he's out, then it's just time to move away from Maddison. As far as Saka, you also have an asterisk there. Saka's a little bit of a concern because he did come off of that Champions League game versus Sevilla with a knock of his own, and he was indicating to his left foot, but it seems like actually it's a relatively non-severe issue, and I do think that based on our previous history of watching Saka play despite a quote-unquote injury, I do think Saka's probably going to be ready to play that Burnley at home fixture, and he's probably going to sort of get himself fit and ready for that fixture. So I'm not too concerned about Saka, and I probably would be a little bit more concerned over Maddison just because he does obviously have problems that he usually struggles to sort of get back onto the pitch with sometimes, at least previously when you look at his sort of Leicester on and off performances in terms of his minutes. As far as Saka, he's been relatively strong enough to sort of play through injury if that's what you want to see it as, and ultimately I think I have more confidence in his minutes. So I'd probably keep Saka, but I also would probably cast a wary eye to whether he's a transfer this week. I probably would not prioritize the Saka transfer, particularly if Arteta throws it into a little bit of doubt, and I'd obviously hold that transfer until the end of the week, until we get press conferences. As far as Son, still a great option for me, but of course, all the sort of suspensions and injuries in the Spurs team, of course, going to have knock-on impacts towards Son. And I do think he's actually just generally a good hold because also we are struggling for good options at the midfield price point. If you want to go into Son and go out of Son, I probably once again would advise going out of Son after the Aston Villa game, because after that Aston Villa home game, that's probably where you want to jump off of Son for the time being. But yeah, I also think I can see him as a long-term hold. I would not drop him right now because I'm not going to say that those defensive injuries are going to have that much of a severe impact on Son, who's basically looked like a supreme asset so far. As far as Fernandes, Odegaard and Rashford, no changes there. There's of course an asterisk on Odegaard and Rashford. Of course, I'm not too concerned about him in terms of him actually starting in the Premier League. Probably a little bit of a freak accident, unfortunately, with the Copenhagen red. As far as Odegaard, unfortunately, it seems like he's also struggling with fitness, and we need a little bit more detail from Arteta on this sort of exact state of his injury. But of course, him being kept out of the previous two Arsenal games is not a good look, and probably he's going to be an immediate transfer out for most players. And of course, you have so many great options in terms of the middle price points, where I think if you're, let's say, holding on to someone like Odegaard, this is probably the time to actually consider reducing the funds that you have expendable in the midfield and actually moving towards players like Mitoma who have good fixtures, or even, for example, just simply downgrading towards a Bowen or a Martinelli for the time being. As far as Salah, of course, he remains supreme as the king. As far as the defensive positions, if we move on quickly towards there, we have Lamptey as a new option, but I think there's a huge asterisk still around him. It's more so the case that if he's ready and fit for the Sheffield United fixture, then of course he's good to go as a pick, but he doesn't really have too much value. On the other hand, you've got Branthwaite in this position, who's actually not too bad if you really want to have another player who seems like he's going to be permanently starting in the future, because of course Branthwaite has been absolutely class for Everton. However, with Lascelles, I think what I would say is I still prefer Lascelles for the time being. And unfortunately, the issue with, let's say, other players in this price point is, even if you own Branthwaite, it might be the case that actually you don't find too many fixtures for him to be good enough to be played, Whereas I think with Lascelles, you have a player who at least can be played in the short term until Botman's back. And we don't really know exactly when Botman is back. It seems to be quite a long-term injury. It might be even the case that after the international break, he might not be back. So I do think Lascelles feels nice as a short-term pick if you really want some coverage over some decent fixtures, and at least, of course, coverage of the second best defense in the Premier League. So that's why Lascelles is actually a great option still. And I probably would not look at Lamptey and Branthwaite for the time being. As far as Guehi, Mitchell, and Livramento, Mitchell's new, but really he's just the same option to me as Guehi. Of course, he scored a goal, but it's not like Mitchell, for example, as a fullback, who really is, not a wing back, for example. The way Crystal Palace play is pretty much a flat back four, and you can see the underlying stats for players like Mitchell or even Ward. It's not particularly good, and that's why there's not a huge difference between, let's say, someone like Guehi or Mitchell. In fact, Anderson, of course, has better underlying stats. Now, the case is, of course, Anderson is now 5.1 million, which is quite ridiculous, in my opinion, for that sort of price point, compared to some of the attacking fullbacks who, of course, have the propensity to be a lot better, or even, for example, Saliba, who does still play for a level up of a defense. And so for that reason, I do think that Mitchell and Guehi are probably options that I would prioritize if I was looking for a Crystal Palace defender, and I'd probably try to save up as much money as possible. Part of the reason why, of course, Anderson has not been part of these cheat sheets is just because I do think that this is a clear case where you can in FPL just save money on a certain position to cover a certain sort of defense. I would do so. Whereas, for example, with Saliba, previously, the reason why we've always had Saliba is because we know that he's the most nailed defender, and unfortunately, all the other Arsenal defenders do pale in comparison. We thought Gabriel might do that, but already that bench in the Sheffield United game already sort of cast doubt as to whether he would actually play the Burnley fixture, for example, which is an easy fixture, but you want your defenders to play the easy fixtures and not get rested for them. So that's why, of course, Gabriel has not risen, and also Livramento is a new option in the cheat sheet too. So when we talk about Livramento being a great pick, I think that one of the interesting things, of course, is he has the flexibility to play on the left back position, the right back position, and the right wing position. We saw him play right wing because, of course, Jacob Murphy is out, and Almiron doesn't have the fitness to play games back and forth. Newcastle also effectively have around 10 games straight over 31 days. If you look at sort of the future fixture schedule, where Livramento will be covering overseeing, for example, this Dan Burn long-term back injury or spinal injury. So I think Livramento is actually a great pick because we saw him actually start the Champions League fixture at right wing. Then he actually moved to right back when Lewis Hall was subbed, and Trippier moved to left back. However, one of the most interesting things I'd like to point out in the Champions League game itself versus Dortmund was that at around 60 minutes, to probably enable Trippier in his sort of prime position in the right back position, Livramento actually shifted towards the left back position. And that probably suggests one thing, that, first of all, Hall might not be as well rated as Livramento so far, who effectively has been man of the match for Newcastle every time he's played this season, which, of course, is a great thing because the competition really is with Lewis Hall, who unfortunately has struggled in some of his appearances. So for that reason, I think Livramento being able to play left back as well is huge for his minutes potential, and that's why I'm suggesting him to be such a great option from the get-go. As far as Maguire, he gets a rise just simply because he will be starting, I think, for the next few fixtures. It seems like clearly Ten Hag does believe in him. But of course, the concern with Maguire too is just you are once again investing into a very, very weak team from the defensive point of view. But also at 4.2, I think you can also forgive that. At Tsimikas, it's his price. Of course, we thought he was going to be a supreme option, but as it turns out, of course, he was benched, and I think probably we need to keep one eye looking out on the next European fixture to sort of assess whether Tsimikas is probably good to go for the weekend, because, of course, if he plays and starts in that Europa fixture, once again, his ability to start this weekend is going to be called into question. And it's overall a good fixture on paper. It's Brentford at home, so clearly I'd probably consider Tsimikas your third or fourth playing defender this week, but do be wary of his minutes, and that's why he's fallen. Unfortunately, I probably even overestimated his minutes and how much Klopp would have rated him to play in different sort of formations versus different sort of teams. And it's very clear, for example, maybe versus a set-piece heavy team versus a very tall, strong, physical team like Luton, that maybe Tsimikas would not have been preferred, and that's why Joe Gomez actually started that fixture. As far as Gabriel, as I said, I am concerned that he might be even rested for Burnley at home. Of course, he is the player who actually gets involved in a lot of international fixtures and a lot of South American travel. So that does, of course, impact him. And ultimately, Kiwior is still there waiting the wings, who actually can play at any time. As far as Dean and Dalot, Dean falls simply because fixtures get worse and worse for Aston Villa. And we also know Moreno's around the corner. With Dalot, I actually think that you can consider maybe moving away from him, because even though the Luton fixture is perfect, I have heard, for example, and also seen, unfortunately, the mismatch, of course, in terms of Dalot in that sort of 10 versus 11 game. He did make a few mistakes, and It doesn't look good because Aaron Wan-Bissaka has proved to be extremely fit coming back, and we know Reguilon is very close, as well as Shaw. So because of that, I'm a little bit concerned about Dalot's minutes over the weekend. As far as the 5.x position, we have Dunk being added as a new option. A lot of people will be asking about Estupiñán, and ultimately, of course, if we watch the Europa League fixture and Estupiñán seems ready, then of course I would just say Dunk is basically at the same position as Estupiñán, because of course if you can get Estupiñán versus Sheffield at home, I mean that fixture is basically perfect. So you really can't pass up on a fixture like that, and I think that's fantastic for Dunk. Now the question of course is whether you can have guarantees over Estupiñán's minutes, because it does seem like he's also sort of touch and go for the Europa League fixture, and it might be the case that he still needs a little bit more work before he's able to play full 90-minute fixtures. And of course, that's a concern when you look at Sheffield United. However, of course, if he's rested for Europa, and then let's say something like Roberto De Zerbi confirms in a press conference that he will start in the Sheffield game, then, I mean, all aboard the Estupiñán train, really, with the green light there. However, of course, it's very, very hard to sort of get that nailed in. So I do think Dunk for the interim is very good in terms of if you want a player for this week who actually has a really good fixture, and then also a player who arguably has an okay fixture in Game Week 13, then go for Dunk. As far as Walker, no changes there. Porro and Cash fall simply due to fixtures and also suspensions. There's really no need to talk about that too much. I think Cash also, he is back in training, so the asterisk can be taken off of Cash. But the concern, of course, once again, is just the declining fixtures for Aston Villa. I mean, he's probably a transfer out for most players as soon as Game Week 13 rolls around. As far as Virgil, he also falls because I do think he's a touch expensive when we consider this Liverpool defense. Some of those great prime fixtures have gone, and unfortunately, of course, he falls. With the forward position, we don't have too many changes. What I have done, I think, is actually shown a little bit of hesitancy over Brighton, because I do think that actually their attacking numbers from the underlying point of view have actually seemingly dropped as of late. So there's a little bit of a change in terms of how strong Brighton are considered as an attack, in my opinion. And also, given the fact that you have 55 minutes on average between these forward players, it's a huge concern whether you actually really want to be investing into them. Even though, of course, I think this is the prime fixture to own a Brighton forward for. After that, you could argue it's very, very hard to continue justifying owning a Brighton defender. So that's something that I have that's going to be a concern for me. As far as Nketiah, he also seems to have an asterisk over him because he was not included in the Champions League fixture and he has not been in training so far. So, of course, do stay tuned to what Arteta actually promises to us in the press conference before you consider, let's say, Nketiah as a very short-term punt. Right now, I actually prefer Edouard and Calvert-Lewin a lot alongside Cunha, and it's probably a position where probably Calvert-Lewin's actually the best pick, I would say, just because of him being on penalties and the guarantees from that. As far as the other players and other positions, we have Wilson, who obviously has a knock, and he might also miss the Bournemouth fixture. So I think he continues to stay in that yellow position. But in reality, you might be considering Wilson very, very shortly when he's actually confirmed to be back fit. The issue, of course, is when Isaac comes back, and probably for that reason, Wilson will never really rise to a green pick because Newcastle's fixtures are also getting worse and worse as we go by. With Watkins, he also gets a fall because this is the end of his run, I would say. But as I said, because of Tottenham's defensive suspensions, you might actually see that Watkins' run actually probably lasts until Game Week 15. So his sort of permanence as a pick is still very, very good. So I think I would still consider holding him as an option. As far as the goalkeepers, I wouldn't make any changes other than, unfortunately, Vicario falls just due to the suspensions and declining fixtures. And that's pretty much it for the cheat sheet this week. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next video. If you guys haven't already, do feel free to check out the membership section below. You will have access to unique content as well as the ability to sort of socialize with me at any time and also ask me for any sort of one-on-one advice. Otherwise, thank you to the members who've been contributing to the channel, and thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys in the next video.